Hello, welcome to today's low-tech video presentation on grammar. Today we'll be talking about punctuation, specifically the use of quotation marks in places other than quotations, the use of single quotation marks, and underlining or italics. Besides quotations, we also use quotation marks to set off the title of a short written work or parts of a longer work. In the kind of the key word there is something shorter. So short works include short stories, chapters from a book, one-act plays, short poems, essays, songs, and articles. And parts of a longer work would include episodes in a series, songs, parts of a longer music composition, chapter titles, or an item named as part of a collection. And I'll give you some examples of each of these. So, chapter title, quotation marks and underlinings, a chapter from your grammar book. Okay? The Highwayman is a poem. The Star-Spangled Banner is a song. The Interlopers is a short story. The Dog That Bit People is an article, is in your literature book. So you can see all of these are put within quotation marks. Similarly, the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, which is a piece that's part of a longer work, namely the Nutcracker. The Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy is in quotation marks. Fumed Oak, a one-act play, is in quotation marks. The Trouble with Tribbles, an episode from Star Trek, would be in quotation marks. And the News, an essay, another essay in your literature book, would also be in quotation marks. There's kind of a practice, it's not always standardized, but to practice a lot of times to put slang terms in quotation marks to show that these are jargon or some kind of special term that people may not know the meaning of if they're not part of the in-crowd, so to speak. For example, he got in trouble with the gang for dropping dimes. Okay, dropping dimes is a slang term for informing, and that's put in quotation marks. Now, sometimes what happens is some terms originally are put in quotation marks, and if they enter the language generally, then people no longer put them in quotation marks. I can remember back in the 80s, for example, when newspapers talked about a drug bust and it involved crack cocaine. Crack was a relatively new product, I guess you call it product, and that was a slang term for it, and so they put it in quotation marks. Now, 30 years later, if somebody's arrested for it, they don't put it in quotation marks anymore because it's kind of entered the language more or less. I talked about this before. We were talking about embedded quotations. So explicit definitions are kind of treated like embedded quotations, and they are put in quotation marks. And it's especially if they're a direct quotation from a source, but a lot of times people do that even if maybe it's not a direct quotation. So usually it's with verbs such as means, defines, or is defined as. So kilty means a fringed leather flap found on some shoes. Okay, that would be put in quotation marks. Or kilty is defined as a fringed leather flap found on some shoes. Okay, now you don't always use that. For example, if there's a definition followed by the verb to be, the definition is treated as a predicate nominative. It's not put in quotation marks normally. So if you said a kilty is a fringed leather flap found on some shoes, you probably wouldn't put that in quotation marks. Now, you might recall that sometimes we use single quotation marks. And single quotation marks are used for a quotation or a title inside another quotation or title which uses quotation marks. So, for example, if you were quoting, say, a teacher or someone said, how many of you have read The Lady of Shalott? Now, The Lady of Shalott is a poem. It would be put in quotation marks, but it's part of a quotation. So you have the quotation first. Those would use the normal double quotation marks. And then The Lady of Shalott, which is inside that quotation, would use the single quotation marks. Notice in this case it's asking a question, would be true whether it's making a statement, that the closing single quotation mark comes before the question mark because the question mark is not part of the title. Okay, if you have more than one title or quotation within another title or quotation, you alternate double and single quotation marks. So for example, Helen said, she asked us, how many of you have read The Lady of Shalott? I had. Okay, in this case, you've got a quotation. You've got a quotation within the quotation, so you have the single quotation marks, and then you have the title, which uses quotation marks inside that, so that's back to double quotations. I can think of 3 instances that I've read where there are 5 levels of quotation marks. And that's like a quotation, within a quotation, within a quotation, within a quotation, within a quotation. That's going pretty far. I've seen that in a couple of novels by Joseph Conrad, and also in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Obviously, Ovid's Metamorphoses, the original Metamorphoses, were written before the use of quotation marks, and so you don't usually see it in the Latin, but you do see it in a lot of translations. You may have noticed sometimes in the British Isles, what's going on? Sometimes the use of single and double quotation marks is reversed. So an ordinary quotation or an ordinary title would be in single quotation marks, and then the quotation within the quotation would be in double quotation marks. You may have noticed this even in school. Some editions that we have of works that were written in England will sometimes do this. I think some editions we have of some of the Charles Dickens stories, for example, will do this. And if you see that, you get used to it. You realize that's all they're doing. Okay, underlining and italicizing have the same value. They mean the same thing. Okay, usually handwriting and typing show underlining. Typesetting for print usually does it in italics. Now, in the computer age, most computers, you have a choice. You can click the U button for underlining or the I button for italics, and it really doesn't make any difference. However, we've kind of gotten into the practice of using italics because underlining a lot of times in computer files means a hyperlink, which of course is something that has to do with navigating through the computer. It doesn't have anything to do specifically with punctuation. However, whichever way you choose, be consistent. Now, when I was in high school, before we had personal computers, we used typewriters. So if we typed out something that needed italics or underlining, we would always use underline because we have to type out the word and then backspace and then hit the underline key a bunch of times. And also that's usually the case with handwriting, unless you've got nice calligraphic handwriting that you can make italics that stand out. Most of the time people use underlining if they're writing by hand. But whichever way you choose, be consistent. Okay, so titles of longer written works are underlined or italicized. So longer written works include books, full-length plays, films, longer musical compositions, and periodicals. So here's one, I Like Oklahoma. Okay, and in this case, the person is talking about the musical Oklahoma. If they just said, I like Oklahoma, with no punctuation other than the capital O, they would say, oh, you're talking about the state. If you said, I like Oklahoma, inside quotation marks, you'd say, oh, you're talking about the song. Oklahoma, where the wind, you know that song, I can't sing, but anyway. Whereas if you said, I like Oklahoma in italics or underlined, then we would know you were talking about the musical, the longer composition. So here's one, it kind of gives you a feel for this. I liked Macbeth, italics, but not Macbeth, not italics. In other words, I like the play Macbeth, but not the character of Macbeth. In fact, that's why it's always helpful to understand this rule, especially with works like, say, Macbeth or Robinson Crusoe or something like that, where the name of the work is the same as one of the characters in the work. That way the reader knows if it's underlined or italicized, you're talking about the work and not about the person in the work. Okay, here's another example showing, periodicals, books, and full-length movies. Time magazine carried a review of Blade Runner, the film based on the novel Do Androids Dream of Mechanical Sheep? Okay, notice Time magazine, the name of periodical, is italicized. Blade Runner, the name of full-length movie, is italicized. Do Androids Dream of Mechanical Sheep? The name of a novel. Notice also that in this case, the question mark is italicized because it's part of the title. It's actually not asking a question in this sentence, it's just part of the title. Okay, titles of radio and television series or programs, as well as works of art, are underlined or italicized. So, Rodin's The Thinker. Okay, that's a work of art. It's underlined or italicized. We used to watch reruns of Gilligan's Island. That's underlined or italicized. My favorite Star Trek episode is The Trouble with Tribbles. We saw this sentence earlier. Notice, Star Trek, the series or the program, is italicized. The individual episode is put in quotation marks. Titles of longer poems, music albums, and longer musical works are underlined or italicized. So, Idols of the King is a long poem, in case you hadn't noticed. That would be italicized or underlined. The music album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, would be italicized. In fact, there's also a song by that name. Obviously, we're talking about the song rather than about the album. That would be in quotation marks. And a longer musical work, in this case, La Boheme is an opera. It's underlined or italicized. Again, this is using a computer, so we're generally using the italics as you would on most computers these days. Okay, the specific name of individual air, water, space, and land craft. Okay, we're talking about if those craft have a particular special name. Usually we see that with ships and with spaceships. Sometimes we see it with airplanes and other things as well. So Challenger, which is a space vehicle, that would be italicized. Enola Gay was the name of a specific aircraft. That would be italicized. Captain Bligh commanded the Bounty. Bounty was the name of the ship, so that's italicized. Those of you who are fans of the musical Grease know he called the Chevrolet Greased Lightning. Greased Lightning would be the name that he gave to his automobile. Okay, notice Chevrolet is not italicized. That's just a brand name. That's not a specific name given to the specific vehicle. Now, something that's maybe a little bit tricky for some people. It's really not a big deal, but if an italicized or underlined name or title appears in the title of a work or some other writing which is otherwise italicized or underlining, what you normally do is the specific item that would be underlined or italicized twice is used in standard type. This is always done in bibliographies and other formal writing. So, for example, there's a book called A Commentary on Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress itself is the title of a book. It would be normally italicized, but since it's part of the longer title of the book that's a commentary, Pilgrim's Progress is not italicized. So that's the way that would normally be done. Sometimes you do see people that would keep the whole thing italicized to make it less confusing, especially if it were in the middle of a sentence. People sometimes do this to avoid confusion. Again, in formal writing, standard written English, certainly in bibliographies, you wouldn't do it that way, but you do see this occasionally, so I do mention it, even though, as I said, it should be avoided in any formal writing. Okay, foreign words that are not part of the English language, generally not part of the English language, not regularly used in the English language, are underlined or italicized. Now, because the English language is very flexible, it sometimes may be hard to tell. But here's an example. That was a pro bono legal brief. Okay, pro bono is a term that's common among lawyers, but not widely used outside of courts and the law. So pro bono would be italicized, because it's a Latin term. Obviously, words that have entered the language, maybe they came from foreign language like champagne or chimpanzee, or thousands of words we have in English like that, are widely used, even abbreviations like etc for etc and so on. We don't usually bother to italicize them because they are widely used and most people recognize them. Okay, also, you underline or italicize words that you want to emphasize. Now, sometimes with a computer you can also do that with bolder print, but generally I say when you're typing or something like that, you usually use italics or underlining. And usually you want to emphasize the word or phrase because of special information you want to call attention to, or because the word or phrase is meant to be stressed in speech. So, for example, he insists that 2 men saw him. Okay, the 2 is italicized just to emphasize it was 2 as opposed to 1 or 3. Probably some discussion about how many men there were. So you would italicize it to show that's what you're emphasizing. You said what to Mr. Blank? Showing that the word what is emphasized in the speech. It's almost like a little exclamation point over that one word or something. Okay, also we use italics or underlining to italicize numbers, symbols, letters, and words which name themselves. In other words, they refer to themselves rather than whatever it is the word or symbol represents. So, if the cheerleader shouts, "Give me a C," you're just referring to the letter itself. It's italicized or underlined. His 2s look like 7s. The 2 and the 7 are italicized or underlined because you're not referring to 2 things or 7 things. You're referring to the figure 2 or the figure 7. How do you spell shepherd? Okay, again, the sentence is not about shepherds. It's about the word shepherd. So that, again, would be italicized. You're talking about the word. Remember, we saw that earlier. So, my dictionary defines kilty, and kilty was italicized. And that's the reason we're talking about the word kilty, not that his kilties were flapping as he walked or something like that. Okay. Most authorities also tell writers to use italics or underlining when using onomatopoeia, especially if you're coining the word. Okay, the hot iron horseshoe went cush as he plunged it into the bucket of water with his tongs. Okay, that cush, you kind of made up the word. That's kind of what it sounds like. So you spell it K-O-O-S-H, and that's, so that would be underlined or italicized. Obviously, this is not necessary for onomatopoetic words that are commonly used in the language, like click or buzz or something like that, that we use every day. Oftentimes, don't even think about them as being onomatopoeia anymore. But if you're coining a word that does that, then you would put it in italics again, kind of like, almost like it was a foreign word, I guess you could look at it that way. Okay, some things you don't. Some titles you don't underline, italicize, or put in quotation marks. The name of the Bible, its books, divisions, or versions, or other religious scriptures and their divisions or versions. So you would just say in 1 Corinthians, the Bible says, 1 Corinthians Bible, or not italicized, underlined, or anything. The same with other religious scriptures. The Talmud's tractate Sanhedrin discusses the laws and history of Jewish religious leadership. Okay, again, Talmud, Sanhedrin, which is one of the books of the Talmud. Those are not normally italicized or underlined or put in quotation marks or anything. Also, you do not underline or italicize or place in quotation marks any government documents. That includes charters, treaties, acts, statutes, reports, and these are treated as simple names, just kind of like the books of the Bible. So the Declaration of Independence, the North American Free Trade Agreement, Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1972. The appropriate words in the title are capitalized, but they're not put in quotation marks or underlined or anything like that. Now, having said that, in a bibliography entry, the published title of a book would be italicized even if it is a scripture. A shorter work would be in quotation marks, even if it is a legal document, because you're following the rules of the bibliography. So here, for example, here's a bibliography entry for the New International Version Bible. Holy Bible would be underlined or italicized because that is the title it says on the book. Similarly, if you were quoting Declaration of Independence from your American Literature Anthology, again, it's treated like an article, so the Declaration of Independence in that case would be put in quotation marks to follow the form of the bibliography. But apart from that, these things normally do not take quotation marks, italics, or underlining. So, anyway, hopefully, learn something new with this. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in class. If you're not in the class, always take a look at the contact page at englishplus.com, and someone will be happy to answer your question. Thank you very much.